And I would say, like, what I've noticed over, my 44 years of life, and particularly, since I really, really came to know the Lord, which I'm still doing, obviously, but
Right.
that God is so amazing that it's not even just in the profane, but it's literally everything that God is willing to use.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Crab on the Cross podcast. I'm your host, Mary Rose, and my guest today is Father Mark Ivany. We have a great conversation about what holiness looks like in a world of tremendous affluence and opportunity and distraction. And what's great about Father Ivany is he always brings it back to what really matters, what this is really all about. It's easy to be legalistic and to follow a strict set of rules about what you can and can't wear, what you can and can't say, how much money you should have, what you should spend it on. And at the end of the day, all of these rules are meant to be a reflection of your relationship with God. It's not the rules that make us holy, it's God that makes us holy. And the closer we get to God, the less attached we are to whether it's material things or our self-image or, our sense of comfort. And that's just an important reminder for all of us. I also want to invite you to check out my YouTube channel, youtube.com/@thecrabandthecross. I recently released my second YouTube video where I share Fulton Sheen's thoughts on the Second Vatican Council. I know that talking about Vatican II often opens up quite the landmine, but I wanted to share what this holy and brilliant and wise man thought about the Second Vatican Council, especially because he actually attended it. I think a lot of people try to make the council in their own image and likeness or in the image and likeness of their enemies. And Fulton Sheen, I think, in typical fashion, cuts through the division and gets to the truth of the matter. And so check out that video and please subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not already done so. Also, make sure you're subscribed to this podcast, either Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, or Google Podcasts. I think I have like 10 listeners on Google Podcasts, and I just want to give a shout out to them for going against the grain with the podcast apps. And now, here's my conversation with Father Mark Ivany. Father Mark Ivany is the Vocations Director and the Director of Seminarians for the Archdiocese of Washington. He's been a priest for 14 years. Prior to joining seminary, he worked in D.C. in politics and government. Father Ivany, thank you for joining me today.
Great to be with you.
So you worked before you were the Vocations Director, you were just in seminary formation, right? Working over at the seminary?
Yeah, I was the director of the spiritual director of the house of the seminary.
Yeah.
And I did that for 1 year, and then I got an additional job of being the vocations director.
Okay.
And I did both of them for 3 years, and then I just started working specifically with vocations, but also doing a few things at the seminary, serving as an adjunct formator and like the director of pastoral formation.
Yeah.
Neither of which took as much time as like the spiritual director. So it kind of freed me up to do more vocations promotion and spending time, with young men that are discerning and encouraging our priests to, kind of be vocation promoters in their own ministry.
So how do you get that job? I mean, how does a bishop or a cardinal, not as an insult, but how they look at you and say, like, he's the person who needs to, form all of our future priests?
Right. Well, as far as the formation side, I mean, obviously it's a team. There's a rector, a vice rector, a spiritual director, and oftentimes adjunct seminary, faculty. So I think part of it is who's going to fit into the team, who's going to add this component to the team, who's going to add that. And ideally, the bishop is looking at his seminary faculty from that broad kind of perspective and filling in all the pieces so that there's not kind of one dominant, kind of model of priesthood or something, because we're all individuals, all within the Catholic priesthood. So I like to think that I bring. I'm not sure what it is that exactly I always bring, but probably the humanity of it. You've met some of the other faculty. They're quite impressive. So
divinity,
right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do you live in the seminary with the guys?
Yeah, I still do. I actually live on the hall with the older guys. It's called Benedict Hall after Pope Benedict, the 16th. And so we live on that hall, and it gives them an opportunity, the older guys, most of whom have already finished college, and they're at St. John Paul II Seminary just for 2 years doing their pre-theology. And there's a few guys that have just life experience. One was a police officer, one was in the Air Force for a number of years. And so they live there as well, but they'll be there for long because they have to finish kind of the 4 years of college. So So we live up there, and it has its own little common room and a little chapel, but everything is still all at the same in the big house. John Paul II, and but we just have there's no Nerf gun wars. There's less pranks.
That's on Father Griffin's side,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. So I enjoy being there and interacting with those guys a lot, and I mean as I do the other guys. But it is nice to have different types of conversations that you would have with older guys as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously it's an incredibly important job, but it also kind of sounds like, I don't know, almost like a cush job for a priest, because you don't have to deal with the parish finance council and the annoying people who call the church and are just pestering. I don't know,
yeah. Well, the annoying people live with you. You wake up, they're there.
Right.
And so we always say, it's the unique ministry where you live with your parishioners, and that's a blessing and sometimes a challenge.
Right.
So it's kind of how you look at it.
Yeah, I almost wonder for the guys that are living there, if it's intimidating to feel like you're always on display and every little weakness you have, Father knows that when I spit the toothpaste in the sink, I don't rinse it or
right. I don't do the bathroom checks. The vice rector does that. So I'm not sure if they can identify who's using what toothpaste. But to your point, I think sometimes. You do. I mean, like you would when you were growing up. I mean, that's the kind of ideal of a seminary is a home, a family where guys feel comfortable to make mistakes, that they don't keep their guard up. And that's one of the things I think we do well. I hope we do well, is that there's a spirit in the house where you can be a normal person and you can make a mistake, and you'll certainly get corrected, but it'll be done in a spirit of charity, in a spirit of, not grave disappointment and 2 more strikes and you're out type of mentality.
That's good.
So, the guys are sometimes they're too free to make mistakes.
Really?
Really? We have plenty of pranks, and I mean they get to be college kids.
Okay.
And seminarians. So.
Yeah. Do you find that when you have to correct a seminarian that they tend to take it well, or do you see them ever especially early on, they kind of crumble with that direct criticism?
It depends on the guy, and I've noticed that after making mistakes myself, is you never correct when you're angry, and you always have to correct with love, to help the other person, and it's kind of an art. There's a lot of grace involved. I'm grateful that I had really wonderful parents. I do have wonderful parents, and my mom was really good at this. My dad was sometimes. He got this later. But everything my parents did, was out of love, and I'm kind of joking about my dad. If you knew him, he's just a big, strong military guy, but. with the rarest of exceptions, anytime that we ever got spanked or disciplined, we knew because we had done something wrong, and Dad was doing that out of love, and that was a huge grace.
Yeah, because I have to imagine that just given the statistics, like you would have a fair amount of guys come in seminary who come from maybe divorced homes or just different family situations. Does that tend to be the case, or do you think they tend to more come from the more whole family?
Right. I mean, compared to the average population, it's more guys have their biological mom and dad who have been married in the church, but there are certainly guys that have, come from single homes, parents divorced or remarried or not, or different situations. A couple guys that fathers kind of split, so it's not quite as bad as
the standard average population,
right.
Yeah,
but it's certainly not perfect,
Right. Yeah. Do you find that things like that tend to come up while they're in seminary, like they affect their ability to receive like certain teachings or certain experiences?
Yes, and you never quite know how it's going to, and it's not the only factor, obviously, in how someone reacts to something, but but you can definitely see that, and I think the faculty members, we see it in each other. The more that we kind of know each other, how we interact, and it's just true for everybody, So
right, yeah. So I want to talk to you a little bit about like how you form people to be holy in the 21st century, because I want to be careful not to act like we're completely different beings than humans were prior to like 100 years ago, but the world today is so dramatically different from the way the world was for the most of human history, right? And when I read like certain teachings in scripture, for example, like let's say, when Jesus talks about things like poverty and wealth, and if you have, 2 cloaks, give somebody 1 cloak, and I'm like, well, I have 12 cloaks, like,
right.
It seems like, especially for living in America, it's a very affluent society. Even if you're relatively on the lower economic end of the spectrum, like you probably have more possessions and food and, things than most people had for most of human history. And so, like, what do you think are some of the challenges of trying to be saint-like in the 21st century? And like, I don't know, do you think like the goalposts have shifted in a sense?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, my first answer would be, I don't really know, because this is the only time I've ever lived.
Yeah, right.
And I do actually love history. I love all history. I love church history, but I'm not like an expert on it. I mean, certainly what you've said is true. But we're like, kind of the top 3%, I mean, there's still amazing vast poverty all over our world. I mean, having been to India to work with the Missionaries of Charity once when I was in seminary,
really?
and having been to Haiti once, and other places, you're like, wow, like maybe this is not that much different. Maybe it's just I'm like super privileged to live in the United States, to have 2 parents that love me, to have grown in the faith, and as I said, my dad was in the Army, and my mom only worked when like all 4 of us were in Catholic schools at the same time.
Yeah.
And so I'm just like really blessed, in materially and otherwise. So I think a lot of it is recognizing that we're pretty privileged.
Yeah. I mean, privilege is definitely a hot topic, I think, in the culture right now. And there's a certain sense in which, like, I have a similar upbringing to you, like great loving family, Catholic family, still intact. All lived in America, obviously, like, not like vast wealth, but relative to people in, Calcutta, like, my gosh, I'm a queen. And like, I struggle almost with feeling guilty for all that I have, in a sense where I'm like, well, should I have less things? But then if I had less things, would that really make, a vast difference in the way that I live my life. And like, it wouldn't really be helping alleviate poverty in this country if I had like, 6 pairs of shoes instead of 10 pairs of shoes or whatever,
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things that we talk to the guys about in our formation talks and different things is simplicity of life. We're going to make a promise. I did already. The guys who get ordained will make promises of chastity, obedience, and simplicity of life. Did I do that right? Chastity, obedience,
poverty.
And, poverty.
You don't say poverty,
right? Is the vow that like Father Andy and religious make, and ours is a prayer. We promise to pray the office, to obedience to the bishop, and to chase celibacy, and then there's this promise of a simplicity of life.
Okay.
And I've a lot of priests, and it's lived very very differently, and some live it really beautifully. The point is, as diocesan priests, you don't have a religious order that's going to take care of you when you're older, and so part of that is like you have to be reasonable in being a good steward of the resources that are entrusted to you, so that you're not a financial burden to the Archdiocese or to the people of God. And so we tend to. When I was a newly ordained priest, I had this similar conversation with one of the priests who was in the rectory. He's a wonderful priest, and I asked him his kind of take on this.
Yeah.
He goes, "Money is simply the thing that I give to people so they leave me alone." and what he was saying is like, he doesn't care about money, and then it's money is what he uses so that he can take care of all the things he needs to take care of, so he can be focused on service, on God, on the things that he feels called to. And so, if having 6 pairs of shoes is going to, aid you in what you need to do, then that's, the number, or
right.
if it's 10 or like, whatever. So it's this idea of it's more the real question is have you given yourself completely to Christ, right? And then when you give yourself completely to Christ, by God's grace, like he becomes the center, and everything, including money, is all just directed towards that.
Yeah.
And there's a real freedom that comes when, by God's grace, we respond to that grace of totality, and it kind of becomes fun. And
yeah, well, it's kind of weird because I think if you're financially well off, one of the privileges of that is that you don't have to worry about money. It just doesn't really cross your mind. Like whenever you're making purchases, you're like, well, can I afford this? Is it in the budget? Blah, blah, blah. And it's like, when it's like, not only if you're poor, like, are you poor, but then you have to constantly have money on your mind, and it's almost like there's it's funny because Jesus says like, it's very hard for a rich man to enter heaven. And so your perception of a rich person is that money is like all they care about. But I don't know, in a strange sense, like I know this for myself, like the less money I have, the more I think about money.
And I think, again, like the underlying question is, what do you think about, and why? Do you, for those that don't have money, are you thinking about money because you don't think God's going to provide? If you do have a lot of money and you think about money a lot, is it because you should be doing something else with it, and your conscience is kind of, But when Christ is more and more at the center, those things, like, it sounds kind of cliche, but those things kind of fall into place,
right? And
in some people, it's a real radical, like St. Francis, literally giving everything away.
Yeah.
Other, I know a few, maybe you do too, people who are extremely wealthy, extremely devout Catholics, are very generous, and their focus is on Christ, and as a result, a lot of people have been blessed by their material wealth. Oh,
absolutely, yeah, for sure. When guys come into seminary, do you put any limitations on how much they can bring or what types of things they can bring?
It's not normally a problem because there's a few guys that either come from pretty wealthy families or, we had one guy who was he's still in the seminary. He was a doctor.
Oh, wow.
And other guys who were lawyers or different types of things. And they either had a lot of money or had the potential to make a lot of money. And so for those guys, as the vocation director, I'm kind of talking with them throughout the process, so they know what to expect, so they don't show up with, a U-Haul full of the size of their rooms and the size of their closet. Is extremely helpful in this situation. So it's never, at least for us, it's never been a huge issue.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And usually when they hear the formation talk on simplicity of life, most guys receive it as with great freedom. Yeah. And it's kind of a welcomed thing.
Yeah. I remember I went to Guadalupe a couple years back, and we stayed with some of the Concepcionista nuns. But one of the things that the people who were leading the pilgrimage said is, like, try not to wear, like, your jewelry and your kind of, flashier clothes or whatever, because these women live very obviously extreme poverty, and it just can kind of almost be a temptation to, like, and not that you'd be going on this pilgrimage to show off your wealth, but just inadvertently you're like, oh, I have this nice bracelet or this, like, whatever, nice outfit.
And it's kind of a neat reminder to think that, wow, like, we're all in this together, and I want to be mindful of, in the same way that someone should be modest in the way they dress when they're in a convent or in a seminary. We have to kind of be mindful of other people.
Yeah.
And we want to encourage them in their vocations and not be a stumbling block in any way.
For sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, actually, the modesty thing is something else that I'm curious about from the perspective of, like, our modern age, because even if you dress relatively modest for modern standards, like, you're still probably showing way more skin than people were in the 1700s. I mean, if you wear, like, a modest swimsuit, for example, it's like, I mean, you're a woman of the night, in the Middle Ages.
Yeah. I don't want to be, like, always contrarian, but like, I know during the time of St. Ignatius, I'm kind of a good friend of, I like to consider myself to be, or him a friend of me anyways. And, when he, after his cannonball, took out his right leg, and as he was recovering, he was so vain that, that he asked him to re-break his leg so there wasn't that protrusion, because the style of the time was guys would wear tights.
Wow.
And that's kind of unfortunate, but I always joke with our seminarians when I give our talks on discernment of spirits. Yeah. And I always joke that, like, some of the guys I've seen on CUA's campus, their pants are, so they might as well be tights.
Right.
And even some of the dresses you see from, I don't know, just back in the day, there seem to there's always, I think there's just always been that type of temptation, in one way or another. Now, maybe in our time, it's more direct in that, it's just simply more flesh, but showing, But I would think that at the time, I mean, whatever is there's always a way to be kind of provocative or risque, or kind of push the limits of whatever is kind of the norm at the time. And so I'm sure people, men and women, were always doing that, and they certainly still do it today. Right. And so the problem in one sense is the same. It's different. And I mean, I would agree with you in that it's certainly more now. I mean, like yes. So, there's interior, kind of ways and exterior ways, I think, of to help equip young men, and as there would be for young women, to live healthily in today's culture with modesty.
Sure, yeah. I think it's just that we're always trying to push back against like relativism, for example. And yet at the same time, it seems like the standard for something like modesty might be more so, well, don't be provocative according to your culture's standards, versus like a very objective, like this is the line, it's like, okay, if I go to Saudi Arabia and, my ankles are showing, it's like, that's horrible. But if I'm here, nobody would even notice,
Right.
And it's like, is there an objective standard, or is it more just actually relative to the culture that you live in and the way people are going to perceive you,
Sure. And I think we get to create our own cultures in a micro level, and that in our house growing up, there was kind of a culture of how people dress and what my parents allowed. At the schools I went to, there was a culture there. Mm-hmm. When I went to Catholic school, there was whatever, tie and things. Right. And, a couple of times my dad, as I said, was in the Army. We moved around a lot. Public school, it was different. And in church, I know in some churches in Rome and in different places, they have little signs that you can't have. Like, and I think that's great. And we're kind of creating, we're creating a little bit of a culture there.
Yeah.
And yet, yes, we're living in a bigger culture that is certainly more, I guess they use the term open. I'm not sure that's the best term, but liberal or free with their dress, although I don't think free is the right word either.
Sure.
I think a lot of the people that do that are actually very not free.
Right.
They're very captive to the approval of others, being viewed in a certain way by others. And it's actually very, not to go down that whole road, but it's kind of sad. It's very sad actually.
Yeah.
And,
no, I mean, especially for women, you hear about some of the extreme modifications that they can go through, or just the extreme daily routines that they can go through, where it's like, I mean, I don't know if you probably don't see this too much since you're in the seminary, but like right now it's common for women to get eyelash extensions. So I mean, forget just like something surgical, but like they're getting like fake eyelashes glued onto their eyes, so they stay there for months and months, and it's
that's
like
amazing.
Yeah.
So it's weird because we actually lived in the Middle East for a while, and
Really?
and
What country?
in Saudi Arabia.
Oh,
and,
really?
Yeah, and Kuwait, and you mentioned it earlier.
Wow.
And my little sister, she got her master's degree from the American University of Beirut in Lebanon, and I think Lebanon, at least for a while, per cap, had like the highest percentage of people who were getting nose jobs.
Really?
And even in other cultures where women are forced to wear abayas and things that cover there's still like plastic surgeries, like a thing. So there's like these kind of two radical extremes where on one side we're like, changing our bodies and all these types of things. And the other side, there's this extreme guilt for going against this other notion that says, how I am is totally perfect. And I mean, whatever it is. And if I adapt anything about me to attract somebody or to feel good about myself or whatever, then there's something wrong. And that's not true either.
Right.
I mean. So.
Yeah, no, I see that too. You see the people who are kind of reactionary, who it's like, well, I'm not even going to shower and you should accept me because it's not the inside that counts. And it's like, well, we are bodies and souls, and
right.
I mean,
it's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But I mean, even like you think about, okay, like nature, if you go out into the woods, there's a lot of beautiful things out there, but it can be kind of a mess. And so if you want to build a house, you're going to, clear a space, and you're going to plant some trees, and you're going to pull the weeds. And, I mean, I don't know, maybe to a certain extent, that's just the same way you cultivate your own body. It's like you fix a couple things. You're not going to completely change it. You're not going to take a flower and like dye the petals another color. Maybe.
Right.
Although I don't know. I mean,
they actually do that. I think they put
really?
stuff in the water and they make, it's true. I was with driving with my Hungarian grandmother. She lives in Cleveland, and I was driving, and we're going through the valley, and she looks around, and it was fall, and there's obviously all these leaves all over the forest. You can see into the forest, and she goes, "Who's going to pick up all these leaves?"
Yeah,
I was like, not Mama.
Right.
It's the forest. Like no one's going to pick up the leaves, and just this notion that like there is, because in her backyard, obviously she pays someone to pick up the leaves, and it's designed, and it's beautiful, and we're meant to cultivate the earth, and there's something good that we have control. We're rational beings.
Right.
We can objectively say it's better to comb your hair. It's better to shower. It's better to, looking at the whole person after, all the data is in, all the, the centuries of being human. We can say people that do certain types of things, combing your hair, getting up on time, certain ways to deal with interpersonal relationships and, prayer. Like, people who do these things are happier. Their lives are full, more full. And that's one of the things I think the church takes a lot of heat for, is that we're not afraid to say there's actually an objectively better way to live your life. And while, as we would still say that, as Pope Benedict said when someone asked him how many paths are there to heaven, he said, as many as there are people. There's certainly something very true with that, about that, but it's within the parameters, the structure that God has given to us, and the church reminds us of.
Yeah. No, it's so true. I mean, I think of like when St. Paul says where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. And it's like, or you have this kind of parameter of like, there's certain, moral boundaries that you cannot cross. And a lot of people get very hung up on that. But once you kind of accept that and live within that, I mean, it's limitless possibilities in terms of what your career could look like, what your personality could be like, and
what your relationship with God can look like. I mean, what gives you purpose and meaning. I mean, that's why one of the things I've been thinking about your show. I really love the first I was like, the crab and the cross. And I heard you kind of explain the whole St. Francis thing. And I was like, all right, I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I actually been like thinking about it the last couple of days, and I actually would, and maybe you've already thought of this. In fact, you probably have. But just from your initial explanation, and if any listeners, I'm sure they've heard your introduction of St. Francis, he's in a storm and he throws the cross in, right? And then he ends up on the shore and there's this crab. This cross, right? As you explained. And this, I guess this whole show, right, is about like kind of the coming together of the sacred and the profane, or however you want to. And I would say, like, what I've noticed over, my 44 years of life, and particularly, since I really, really came to know the Lord, which I'm still doing, obviously, but right. That God is so amazing that it's not even just in the profane, but it's literally everything that God is willing to use. I just had this conversation with one of our seminarians, and I asked what he was going to do with his Saturday afternoon. He goes, I got to write this paper on Hobbes, the philosopher, who was certainly no friend of the Catholic Church, and his philosophies were used in persecutions and different things. And I was like, oh, that sounds. He's like, yeah, well, and he, we just had this conversation, and I remember being just like, him when I was in the seminary, and we had this conversation, and where it ended up was, first we were, we're kind of like complaining about Hobbes basically, and how wrong he was. And then by the end of our conversation, which wasn't very long, we looked back and said, isn't it amazing that all over the world, Catholic seminarians now for a number of years study Hobbes? It's like a prerequisite. Yeah. And obviously they're not studying Hobbes to like think like Hobbes or imitate him. But it reminded me of that the scripture. God will make his enemies his footstools. And I can't remember what psalm it is, but just this notion that the enemies of God will eventually be used to give God glory. And it's not like the enemies of the God will be thrown out and used for nothing, but no, right. Like he's actually going to use them as he's going to put it to use. Yeah. Yeah. And so it's not just the profane, but I mean, it sounds heretical without thinking about it. But even the things that are that attempt to do us evil and harm, God is so amazing that if a Christian allows God to work through him or her, like it can be turned around totally. And so Hobbes and all of his mistakes can be used to glorify God. And now seminarians have a greater understanding of, and it's not like Hobbes got everything wrong. I mean, some of his thoughts and things were the ways that he thought, can be imitated. But, and so, I mean, what does Augustine say? That all that God has to do to make evil, all that God has to do to make good come from evil is to touch it. And I've seen that in my own life. Like, it's hard to let God touch your evil. But when you do, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Oh, no, I know. One of the most recent interviews I did, that it's not out yet, but I talked to a priest who, he's in his 50s. He's only been a priest for a year. He spent 20 years as an alcoholic and then got sober, went into recovery, went into addictions counseling, now as a priest, and it's like, it's beautiful that he's had that path. Like as much as like, I think we want things to be like, all right, you graduate high school, then you go on to your whatever, if you're going to priest, you go to seminary, and then you become a priest, and you're a priest for 75 years. And like, we like those very neat trajectories, but like when you read the Gospels, like Jesus doesn't always take the direct path from like point A to point B. He's like, we're going to stop over here in the Decapolis, and I'm going to exercise this one guy, even though it's totally out of the way. And it's like, I don't know. Sometimes I think that we impose certain, because we're so used to operating within like a moral framework that has very strict parameters, we sort of impose other parameters, I think, on God, where he only operates in these like maybe 3 ways or something.
Exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. And that's why one of the things I love, even today's gospel, the parable or the story of the unjust judge, where Jesus says God is like an unjust judge. He like shakes us out of that mentality, and God, and he uses this story of it's a story of perseverance and prayer, but it goes to show that God is constantly working in situations, and what we perceive to be problems and obstacles are oftentimes opportunities, or are opportunities. And one of the things I just found interesting in the last 5 years, I've read this one book in particular called The Mindful Catholic.
Dr. Greg Bottaro.
Right, former Franciscan friar, the Newell, went to the Divine Mercy University across the river here in Virginia. And then there's this podcast called The Golden Hour. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of it.
I don't think I've heard of that.
It's a doctor, a medical doctor. I think he teaches at Harvard Medical School, and I think he's a numerary in Opus Dei. And the podcast is all about optimal work.
Okay.
And listening to and so this one thing, Catholic mindfulness and this thing, optimal work. How can you be productive? And what I've seen is like there's all these overlying concepts of, and one thing that they shared is that crosses, are the things that we think are the problems and are bad, the people that we think that they're not always what they seem, and even when there is real evil or injustice intermixed, that God is still doing something. In the parable of the unjust judge. So like this woman wants the judge to render a just decision. Like she's legitimately being, taken advantage of, oppressed. And it says she was asking him for a long time. And the point is that God was doing something in her. I mean, I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying that this, but because of her situation, she changes. It's like the 6th rule of Ignatian's first 14 rules of discernment. In a time of desolation, it is, while it is not advantageous to change someone's plans as their spiritual orarium or daily, it is advantageous to change yourself, to grow in perseverance, to grow in trust of God, and so what you see in this parable is this woman's changing radically. She's growing in her relationship with God. And the persistence that Jesus upholds in this story is is the persistence of a relationship with God, and that's what changes everything. And so, Catholic mindfulness and these optimal work type of things that are just really great. I mean, I really enjoy them. They're all about relationship with God, and being changed and not seeing things as the enemy wants us to see everything, and certainly every person. You know?
Yeah. No, I mean, we were talking earlier about, the negative side of being provocative, but like Christ is provocative, not just in the Gospels, but in God in our daily life is often provocative. I think he behaves provocatively. He tries to provoke, things out of us. And one of the things is faith. Like when we ask for something and we don't receive it, I think it can often seem like, well, God doesn't care about my prayers. He answers everybody but me. These are all thoughts I've had before,
Right.
But like often he's trying to provoke like a deeper faith from us. And I think really also to lead us to expand our vision of what we're asking for. Like, that you're asking for something that's too small or too limited. And I want to like expand your vision, which can be painful because then you have to like open your eyes and
Yeah, open your heart. I mean, Augustine says that one of the reasons why God doesn't answer our prayers right away is so that in the interim, our hearts expand, and so we can receive more. And I think we see that with the gospel we were just talking about with the woman, and I've seen it in my own life. I'm sure most of our listeners have, if we're honest with ourselves, if we haven't given up,
right?
That God. And again, the greatest reward is not like always, as you're alluding to, the answer or the thing that we want, but it's Christ himself. And that's, oftentimes we're trying to, we want to find, the trick or the way to live our life that, we don't have these problems or we don't do these things. But that's just our humanity trying to be independent of God. I mean, the whole point, there are challenges that God doesn't answer, is so that we actually grow in more dependence upon him, and greater trust of him, and abandon ourselves to him more radically. And that's like the freedom that allows us to see a cross as a blessing, or to grow in these different ways. And I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Yeah.
These are the things that I...
No, I mean, it's really true. And it's really the paradox of the cross, because the thing that we least desire and that is least appealing to us is like also the place where we meet God and the place where we experience our victory and all these things. And that's kind of the day-to-day life, is like I don't know if the goal is to get to the place where the cross doesn't seem no longer seems detestful, or if it's actually the point where even if it looks detestful, like that doesn't stop you, know? Like, I don't know if the point is like to say you get diagnosed with a terminal illness, to be like, great.
Yeah, right.
That's what I wanted.
Right. That's a great question. And, I think some of the saints did do that kind of stuff. They had
I
that,
know.
They had that kind of faith.
I know. I think I remember, like Therese, like when she's like was bleeding, she's like, "Oh, good, like I'm gonna die."
Right.
Soon.
and I think there's a grace that allows somebody to not just to say something like that, but to be in a place with the relationship with God where that's what you say.
Yeah,
because
where they mean
that's
it.
what you believe.
Yeah,
that's what you believe.
Yeah,
and that's true for you. And St. Paul, he prays that this thorn in his side be removed. And if you have cancer, like by all means, like we should pray that we're healed. And yet there's these certain situations and certain people at certain stages of their relationship with God where they can, and we should all hopefully be able to see God at work in all situations, but sometimes it's recognizing something more, a cross that's really difficult to see,
right,
to accept.
Yeah. I want to ask you also about like so of course there's the crosses that we experience that we don't ask for, but then there's this act of like taking on like voluntarily some kind of cross, some kind of penance. And, you know, it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. Like, I feel like my life is so luxurious compared to most of the world's populations. And at the same time, like, you know, people who lived in much more austere circumstances were doing really intense penances, really intense fasts, you know, bodily mortification, things that just don't have any appeal whatsoever. And, you know, I feel like for me, like a lukewarm shower, like that would be like,
Right.
you know, something penitential, whereas most people is like, to even have a shower would be amazing, you know? So like, how do you guide people to make intentionally, I guess, sacrificial choices
Sure.
in a very luxurious world?
Yeah. Well, first, maybe to say a word about the relationship of the saints and all this. You mentioned, you know, comparing yourself to saints and things, and something really good about that. There's also something really dangerous, and like we have to remember, like the saints are our friends, and they love us, and they want us to be happy and do well and become saints, and so they don't want their examples to shame us or to guilt us or to make us feel bad about ourselves, and they don't want us to do things that they did simply because they did them. They did those things because they were motivated by God and drawn to God, and those were things that helped them grow closer to God. And at the same time, we also don't want to not acknowledge some of the things that saints did that were on the path of holiness. So all that's to say is, we want to keep the saints our friends, and not use them to be, and not let them be guilt trips. So, I guess getting back to the more direct question, though, of how do we use, you know, mortifications, penances, and I'm thinking of Saint Thomas More, who, you know, kind of like us to some degree, lived he was pretty well off. He was, you know, the Chancellor of England and all these things, and so, like, he wore a hair shirt. I mean, he had to go to, like, he couldn't do like Amazing Great Fast because he had to go to these parties and do things and stuff. So, but he always wore, or I don't know if always, but he oftentimes, or maybe always, wore a hair shirt underneath his like fancy kind of things that he had to wear. You know, the Jesuit, I'm forgetting his name, but he ended up in China. Ricci.
Oh, Matteo Ricci.
Ricci, thank you. You know, he was in the court and he had to wear like all these fancy things and eat all this stuff, and then there's Saint Francis Xavier, his, you know, brother Jesuit, who is like in rags, starving, you know, and then still doing penance, you know, and so it does depend on your state in life. It depends on your, I mean, prayer and penance is for everybody. I mean, mortifications is for everybody. It's just how that's done and is going to vary a great deal. When the early Jesuits came to this continent in Canada and North America, Canada and in the upstate New York, they get there and they're like about to start teaching the Native Americans about prayer and fasting. They're like, they're already doing more than what we do as penance, you know. And so, that being said, we don't want to use that as an excuse.
Sure.
The whole point is that there is no, how to word this, but there's no growth in holiness without the cross. I mean, and so again, looking at the cross as Jesus did, as like it's bad, it's difficult, it's challenging, but it's actually ultimately a good thing.
Right.
And so we are humans. We suffer from concupiscence, from original sin, and so there are desires and things that we're gonna have. We're gonna be drawn to the path of least resistance, and so the church gives us these gifts of penance and mortifications to stay focused on Christ.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there are certain sacrifices that people are more than willing to make for, I think, to look good, whether it's to be in shape or to look attractive. I mean, you mentioned women getting a nose job. Like, I heard the recovery from that is brutal,
really?
Yeah. Or, even just, there's like a popular thing in health where people will, they'll voluntarily take an ice bath, like, to like fight inflammation, all those things. It's like, you don't want to take a cold shower, but you'll take an ice bath,
Right.
Or, if I do, like, I'm not going to put a rock in my shoe, but I'll wear high heels. And that's also painful. And so there's certain things that we're willing to accept pain for, but it seems like when it comes to the Christian life, like if it's going to cause pain, we're like, nah.
Right. And with St. Paul, right, he says that athletes deny themselves all kinds of things to win a crown of leaves that withers.
Yeah.
And so, when we give ourselves to Christ, really there's nothing that's out of bounds. There's no part of life that we're unwilling to use to become like Christ. And some of us, particularly those of us that could have a very easy life, that we're going to need to employ these types of things. So maybe it's not using salt and pepper, not using condiments, not using not eating dessert, or things that will have no benefit, I guess physically or aesthetically,
right.
that we can do that no one will know about. I mean, you may want to run something by your confessor or if you have a spiritual director, but I mean, you should if you have those things and you're thinking about, but we all can do, little things, and sometimes, when we're sure that it's from the Lord, or we're pretty sure, we can even try some bigger things.
Yeah, I went to Lourdes this past summer, and we got to tour the house of Saint Bernadette. I don't know, have you ever been there before?
To Lourdes, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm trying to think if I've ever been to her house, but I've certainly been at Lourdes.
Yeah, but they talked about her life just...
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, I've been there.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, she lived at the
right.
mill,
yes.
and extreme poverty. At one point, her family was so poor they had to move to a jail, the old jail, and it just was almost shocking to me that, when Mary appeared to her, one of her main messages was penance. I'm just thinking, this little girl has the most penitential life of anybody, and it's hard for me to wrap my mind around that. It would make more sense to me if Mary appeared to a wealthy person and said, you need to do penance.
Right. Yeah. And again, I mean, I think we got to be careful about comparing ourselves. And I don't think St. Bernadette would have thought herself to be, I bet she would have been wow, I have so much. I have a roof, and we have this old cell, and my own father came to this country when he was very young from Hungary, and with his parents, and they were very, very poor. But that's where my dad grew up. He didn't know he was poor, and so so that's why Mary can come and do that, and doesn't. It's not a horrible thing for a mother to say to one of her daughters, because it's out of love. And so when we have these inspirations, or maybe when we're prodded a little bit to do something as well, it's going to be out of love.
Yeah. I think about the saints. They're sort of like the pro athletes, the Olympians. I don't know if you've ever looked at what Michael Phelps does in a day, but it's unbelievable. I mean, what he eats, his exercise regimen, it's out of control. And I mean, the goal for us is not to do what he's doing, but if you were to swim, a few laps a week or whatever, that would be a great thing. And I'm sure that he would, his message to the masses would be swimming is great, feels great, it's good for you. You don't have to swim 40 miles a day. I don't know. I wonder if that's the way that the saints are, or if I'm cutting us too much slack.
I mean, I think it's all in proportion to what God is asking us to do, giving us the grace to do in His bigger plan, and I think that's the main thing. When we start looking at anything out of context of relationship with God, we're eventually going to get off track. You know? I mean, talk purely about, penance or preaching or anything out of the context of relationship with God, it's gonna kind of, a wheel's gonna come off somewhere. And so, God has a plan, and penance and mortifications are definitely gonna be part of the plan for everyone.
Right.
It's just, how that looks will, I think it kind of depend upon, what is needed. I mean, I'm just thinking like these military terms, there's all the different types of soldiers in the Army, and some have the cavalry, and they have tanks and things. They have air artillery, and they have missiles they shoot up to things, and then they have snipers, and and everybody's got a different weapon, right? And they got to learn how to use that weapon. They all need to have the basic training, do the basic everything. But then, and so like a mother of 10, her life and her mortifications are going to look different from the cloistered nun and the single mom, and but I think what you're saying and what we're saying is like, but everybody can get in on this, because it's the cross, because we need the cross, and the cross
is big enough for everybody to take a sliver.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I know you do a lot of spiritual direction too, right? Like with the seminarians, with priests. So does that ever become a part of your conversation, or does it, like, do they come to you asking like, oh, Father, I want to do this thing?
Right. And I can think about for myself, when I was a seminarian, I remember, I read Trochu's book on St. John Vianney, and I was like, oh, this is what I'm doing. This is great. I'm going to start eating potatoes. And I was like, I got sick, and, I wasn't,
my gosh.
because I wasn't eating enough, and I lost energy. And I mean, a saint like that who's living off 2 potatoes a day, or maybe 1 for a while. I mean, they're so in love with Christ that they're not worried about all the things that kind of weigh us down and cause us stress, and like the good opinion of others, and how am I going to handle this situation, and these types of things. It's not that they don't have worries, but their trust in God is so radical that they're able to live and sustain off of so much less. And that's going to be true with like material things too, to kind of tie that back in. The saint doesn't need, the however many pair of shoes or the car or whatever, because they're fulfilled in their relationship with God, and those things actually become dead weight that would slow them down.
Yeah, there's this story, I think it's St. Rita, where she was like traveling with some of her nuns, and they didn't really have a lot of money for travel. Do you know this story?
No,
and like somebody comes along, gives her like a coin, and she puts it in her pocket, and later on she takes the coin out and leaves it, and her sister's like, well, what did you do that for? And she's like, it was too heavy.
Oh, I love it. I love that.
It's like
I was at the same place in Mexico City as you just mentioned, the Conception niches, and there was 2 Franciscans, but I think they're the Franciscans of the Primitive Observance or something. They were
no shoes or something.
Yeah,
right?
they're like, and so they were staying there, and we like hung out for a little while, and then they were going off to a different city in Mexico, and we were going to do something else, and I just pulled one of them aside and I said, hey, let me give you some money for your bus ticket or whatever. And I tried to give him $100.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, thanks. I was like,
really?
What? He's like, no, like, we're good.
Wow.
I'm like, do you have it? He's like, no, we don't have any other money, but God will provide.
Wow.
And like, he didn't, and he wasn't a jerk about it. He wasn't like, holier than thou. He's just like I don't want it. Like it's gonna, it may not weigh me down. I mean, obviously what St. Rita's saying, I mean, there was a weight, but she would have carried a backpack of rocks if it would have saved souls. The point is that it was spiritually heavy for her. And that's what these guys were saying. And that's what that parable that you mentioned, or the scripture passage about the rich, it's hard for them to get to heaven because they have all this stuff.
They have you know what I mean? Yeah, somebody explained that to me recently, that the idea was like a camel was like wearing all these bags on them. And so...
Yeah, there's this story that I guess is true. I don't know, but there's a gate. One of the few gates, or many gates, however many, to get into Jerusalem, the holy city, is that the only gate that you could get into after hours was called the Camel's Gate. So because they closed the big gate, so they're not attacked.
Right.
And the thing about this gate is that this door or whatever is that it's so small that your camel you could get a camel through it with no bags on it. So what you'd have to do is you get there, you stop your camel, you divest the camel of all the material things that you're carrying in, and then the camel ducks its head and barely gets through this thing. And then you got to carry all the stuff in. So the name of the gate was the Eye of the Needle.
The Eye of the Needle.
So,
Yeah,
you're like waiting for me to finish so you can correct me. Yeah, you're so kind. So that's kind of that parable, right? It's hard,
Yeah.
The Eye of the Needle. But
yeah. Actually, I know a priest I talked to gave a similar explanation for like the narrow way, that like it is a similar thing. Like you can't take a lot with you, or that you have to make yourself small to like fit through the narrow way. Because I think a lot of times people read that passage as like, well, God doesn't want a lot of people in heaven, so he made it really narrow, single file. But I don't think that was the interpretation. I don't know if there's a lot of people in heaven, but I don't think it's because God doesn't want him there.
Yeah, well, I promise you, it's not.
You're
a theologian. It's not.
I am a theologian. Yes,
certainly not it. You have your master's in systematics, or God loves us. He wants us all. He wants us all to be in heaven. I'm not saying that everybody's there, obviously, but
right.
There's something really beautiful, I think, about the narrow way in general. I think there's something inside of us that we want to do something difficult. We want to do something that's not easy because we want to change.
Yeah.
I remember when I first started praying and kind of being challenged in my faith and moving from lukewarmness to, it seemed so hard, and the difficult things were things I wanted to go away, but what I have come to see, and what we all come to see, is that I changed. By God's grace, I changed, and so the narrow that particular path didn't seem as narrow anymore. Like it seemed actually pretty easy, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. Is it Thomas or one of the great philosophers and theologians says, the more difficult thing is not always the best. The best thing. We do want to change and grow so much that like difficult things are actually easy. Like that gives more glory to God.
Yeah,
it's not me struggling through this, and I mean that can give glory to God if that's where I am. But there's something, when a person is, for St. Rita to say, no, I don't want to carry this anymore. That's more meritorious than the person who's like, back and forth and like every minute, like, should I carry this? No, I want to. Yeah. I don't want to carry it. And it's like, and she's like, no, I'm leaving it, and like going on and praying, and that's what we want. Yeah. And then the beauty of the cross is that it changes us. You know?
Yeah, and that's what was always challenged for me when like Aristotle would talk about like the virtue as like the mean between two extremes, because it's like, when you're continent, it means that you're wrestling with it and you're fighting it, and like the virtues where it comes naturally and easy, and it seems like the continent space is like, that's really where the tough people are, but no, like it's when you've passed that. And
I mean, I think like the ways that Teresa would talk about the purgative way, and then the purgative, illuminative, and I mean the purgative is where it's super hard. You're like you're being divested of all this stuff, and you're being healed, and then in the later stages, like there's an ease, and there's illumination, and so God is so good.
Yeah. All right, so I want to close with, there's a quote I want to get your take on. So now I know some people hold this figure in suspicion, but he has this one quote that I think is dead on. But Karl Rahner has this quote where he says something to the effect of like the modern Christian will either be a mystic or cease to be. Have you ever heard that quote before?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. What do you think about that?
I guess I agree. And what will it mean to be a mystic will have to obviously, and I think Hunter would agree, is not maybe our first idea of what a mystic in a hermitage or where it's one of the things that obviously people in Opus Dei make a lot of talk about a lot, like being a mystic in in your law office or your school or wherever wherever you are. I think that's gonna. I mean, Pope Benedict would talk about who obviously talked to Karl Rahner a lot, and and they didn't always agree on everything, but obviously they. Anyways, the idea that the church may get smaller, but it's going to be purified, and the way that things at least seem to be going a little bit with the secularization and we see this in seminarians, is that to be a Catholic, it may be more difficult. I know there's another school, and I think Pope Francis would be in the other school that would say, no, well, that's the problem. We have to kind of expand this a little bit and what it means. And obviously there's something true about that. I mean, sure. We don't want to be like small tent.
Right.
But we also don't want to be so wide tent that the bar becomes so low that we aren't becoming mystics. We aren't becoming holy, that we're simply saying, you're okay, I'm okay, everybody's okay, everybody can Catholic, everybody can go to communion, everybody can do this, everybody can do that. And then there's no heroes, there's no saints, there's no,
Yeah. Well, I mean, my experience, now I work in college ministry, and I think the tent can be as wide as it possibly could be, and people will go out of their way to not walk through the tent, Right. I mean, the doors are wide open. There's no barrier to entry. And I mean, there's no barrier to entry into the church. I mean, you come to RCA and be doing whatever, and, there's growth there. And I think you see the same thing with Christ, that there was no barrier to entry to encounter him. And he also went out of his way to encounter the people on the margins. But a lot of people went out of their way to avoid him. And to me, that's my experience, is that, I could have the best free food and the best programming, the best advertisements, but I'm just not going to get a lot of people because they don't want the gospel. And then the people that come are just intense.
Right.
They might be 19 years old, but they're out of control in a good way.
And imagine if you kept catering to the ones that you're not getting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Then all those kids that are really searching for an authentic relationship with Christ, the sacraments, the truth of the gospel, the richness of the church, and all of her truth, beauty, and goodness, they would all kind of go hungry.
Yeah, that's true.
If all your attentions were oh, this person's not coming, this person's not coming, it would be a derelict of duty. You'd be fired. You would definitely be fired. I would push for you being fired, because I see that in vocations work. Sometimes some of the I get a little flack, and what about these types of seminary? We don't have any, this type of seminary. That it's well, there's this French cardinal, and he really turned vocations around in his diocese. And one thing they told his vocation director is, he said, you go where the vocations are, not where they're not. Don't spend all your time trying to bear fruit in barren soil. If there's rich fields, go there and labor. And I've tried to do that in this ministry. Well, at the same time, without taking away from the field work in this, where we're producing vocations, oftentimes down here in Southern Maryland.
That's right. Marys County.
Yeah, exactly. Where is a place where, in one sense, we should be getting vocations? And let's see if we can't expand the richness a little bit, and just keep working from where God is already working and working out, as opposed to leaving where what God is doing and going and doing something where he's not. I don't know if that makes sense. When I was I was the pastor of an African American church, an inner city parish in Southeast DC, and there's a saying in the Black church community is like, do what God is blessing. Don't ask God to bless what you're doing.
Yeah.
And of course that can be taken out of context,
Sure.
but like, I think there's something to that in your ministry and mine where we would have a lot of explaining to do when we died if we just went after the people who are not coming. That was our whole existence. If we just only went to the peripheries,
Right. Well, I think we also just need to define, like, what do we mean by periphery? Because if periphery just means, like, if it's a certain, like, race or ethnicity or economic status, or maybe somebody who has, disability or is socially odd, like, that's, I mean, maybe in that case, they might not be the best priest, but certainly they're welcome in the church, And so if that's what we mean by the peripheries, then go to them. But if we mean by the peripheries people who just aren't interested in the church, they're as far away from the church as possible by their own free choice because they want to live a different life, then that's like the wrong margin. It's not even really the margin because it's very wide,
That's a good point. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because they're right. There's different types of peripheries, and I think the Holy Father's call for us to is like extremely important, because we can all get kind of narrow-minded or overly focused, and sometimes the peripheries aren't that far away.
Yeah.
And
yeah, right, exactly. Like, I'm not going to go like stand outside like, okay, this is terrible, but our college has like a burlesque club.
Interesting.
I'm not going to stand outside the burlesque performance and like hand out flyers for our events. That's just not going to be
it's not a good use of your time.
Yeah, and that's not the right margin to go to. I mean, certainly if somebody was in that and wanted to come over, like, they'd be more than welcome to. But like, yeah, that's not the right margin. And I don't even know if that's what Pope Francis is talking about when he says go to the margins. I don't think he means go to like, I don't know, like the Cardi B concert and be like, hey.
I mean, I don't know. I think on another take would be like, well, that's actually a perfect. I mean, like, who else is hurting more than those people? You know what I mean? Yeah,
that's true. Yeah.
Now, are they the most likely to respond? Probably not. So, I mean, if you've only got a certain amount of time, then I'd probably go somewhere else too. But I think that there's I remember so I don't know, I just to kind of play the other side there. It could be really interesting to go to the
no, that's true.
to stand outside there and you also may you don't need to pick fights, but
right. But I think that's what I'm trying to figure out right now is like, what's the difference between like casting pearls before swine versus like going to the margin to find like the lost sheep or whatever, and I'm sure it's a balance, but it'd be nice if I could read souls and then I could just know like, oh, there's somebody here I need to get. Right.
Well, yeah, but the Holy Spirit can, and you and the Holy Spirit are friends, and I was thinking about your conversation with Father White Andy.
Oh yeah.
And just thinking about how the Lord will put on your heart, who you're supposed to, where you're supposed to be, and what you're supposed to do, and that's. Yeah. Amen. Yeah.
Well, this has been great, Father. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, and best of luck with all of your work with the seminarians. We have a great. I've known so many guys who've gone into the seminary and got ordained, or have left the seminary and not gotten ordained, and they're all wonderful.
Oh, good. Yeah, thanks. Well, I tell you guys all the different things that are going on down here in Southern Maryland have been a huge boost to the whole Archdiocese. It's certainly to the Vocations program, to the seminary, and not just in like numbers, but the relationship with God that guys kind of have coming in, like the conversions, there's just something really authentic. I know it's kind of coming at a price. There's been there's been some serious warfare going on down here, and I'm glad that you guys have not shied away and is bearing so much fruit, and God is good.
Amen. All right. Thank you, Father.
You're welcome. Will we get to hear that really cool music you use every time, or will that only be on this?
We will not hear it. I add that later. I didn't know you listened to it already.
I love that. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Wait, which ones have you listened to?
I listened to part of the last one.
Okay.
And, almost all of the Father Wine.
Oh, okay.
One.
Yeah.
And then I talked to Father Griffin about his, but
I
didn't listen.
Yeah, his is coming up soon. The next one I have is Father Matt Fish.
Neat.
And it was really funny because in the email you were like, oh yeah, we'll let the Holy Spirit kind of take the lead. And when I brought Father Matt Fish in, he was like, you're not going to just be one of those let the Holy Spirit take the lead people, are you? Like, you have questions, right? I'm like, oh yeah, I have questions. And then we didn't talk about anything that I was going to ask him. Right. So I was like, I think I win.